everybody, my name is Bill Oliver, and you're watching my channel called Boston Devops Bill. A couple of episodes ago, we created a Vagrant file, and last episode, we created a JSON file. Today, we're going to put them together. So, pull up a seat, let's have some fun. But before we do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Vagrant system, okay? Just a couple of brief notes. Because we left last time, and then we did the JSON file. So let's find out the status of our JSON of our Vagrant host, which we defined. So I'm just going to type Vagrant status, and it's currently still running. So I'm just going to run a Vagrant halt, and that's going to halt our virtual machine. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this, and the reason I'm deleting it is because we're going to make major changes to our Vagrant file, and more importantly than just making these changes is we're going to change this host name. So when we change the Vagrant file, any changes we make reflected to the current provisioned environment. And that's why Vagrant wants us to put a Vagrant file in a directory that represents that particular host. Well, we're changing the host now. So if you want to preserve this file, make another directory, copy the Vagrant file to that directory, and you should be all set. So I just shut it down, and now I'm going to destroy it. Okay, and destroy, and I'm going to give it the -4 so it won't ask me a question. And there we go, it's gone. So if I run a Vagrant status, and the reason why we want to clean it up again is, because it keeps things tidy, and we like tidy things, don't we? Okay, so now that we've taken that out the way, let's jump over to the editor. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin by changing this comment here. And we're going to add a new comment. Okay, we can call this Vagrant file. And we're going to say it's going to be created. And today is June 6, 2018. Please put in your date. And for a log, we'll say, okay, 6/18, 6/30. 18, and what we're going to state is that created and incorporated JSON VM file into Vagrant file. Okay, that should do it. Close enough. All right, so what we're going to start with is we're going to suck this whole file into an array. And the file which I'm talking about is a JSON file. So to do that, we're going to define an array called nodeconfig. And we're going to assign it the value of JSON.parse, and this is a method which within the JSON class that will allow us to read in JSON strings. So if we simply had a double quote, I'm going to put a back quote and then say host, that's colon, and say my host, what this does is this particular string is valid JSON. And that's what this command is expecting. It's expecting a string, a set of strings that describe the JSON key value pairs. But we're not going to give it a string. We're going to give it our entire file. And to do that, we're going to use the file read command. Okay. And we're just going to read the file and dump it into this function and let it handle it itself. I'm going to give it, let me see, the path to my file, which is the VM machine file that we created in JSON. Okay, that looks correct. Okay, so now we have the entire file inside of our node config file, and inside of node config describes our each node of our machine. Okay, so prior to starting last episode, we did a lot of modifications. We created two instances of nodes, build prod and test prod, which are defined as an object. So our entire machine node, virtual node, which we're describing, is represented as an object inside of JSON, and more importantly, inside of an array called VM machines. So we'll index through this, 0 being build prod, 1 being test prod, in order to access these values. Now, I made a couple of mistakes. We didn't really run the file, so I'm correcting them now. Inside of each one of these, the virtual machine, the value key underneath ports should be ID. And inside of test prod, okay, so I just made the change inside of build prod. Inside of test prod here, our second element of our array, I'm going to change that to ID also, and I'm also going to change the host port to 9090, okay? And that should solve that problem, which we would possibly run into. And the problem was that each one of these ports we define for the host can be used only once because it's now connected to that particular VM box. And when we change the IP addresses, when we change the node name, we didn't change the port addresses. So I wanted to do that, and we have this ID here, and I'm not going to call the node test. I'm not going to call the port ID HTTPD. I'm going to call it net. Okay. You need doesn't need to be called anything, but that's what I'm going to call it. So let's come in here, and the first thing which we're going to do to use this is we're going to go ahead and we're going to define an array. And the array that we're going to use is node config, which we defined right here. So now we're going to say nodes. Is it node or nodes? It should be nodes because we're pluralism. Okay, nodes config. And we want to create this, and we want to index into our VM machines, because for each machine that we do, okay, so let's put each here. Each is a construct within Ruby that will iterate over each one of these array elements for us. So it will make things nice and tidy, especially when I try to explain this. All right, and config. So we're going to call all the value. each node for a machine that comes in here, we're going to reference it using the value node array config. Okay, or node, that doesn't sound right. Node array entry. Okay, so we're going to call it node array entry. So the first value inside of node array entry is going to be our build prod machine, which is right here. That's our first value. Our second value is going to be test prod. But when we're on build prod, we're going to be able to access each one of these particular key values within this object and use the key value to assign the value associated with it. So I just opened up a brace, and I'm going to close that brace way down at the end of the file, okay, between the two ends, okay. And let me format that. Okay, there we go. That's looking good. Now, everything contained between the node config block here is going to be part of our iteration that we will go through for each machine. Okay, so what we did for one machine, we're going to do the same thing, but only we're going to do it for its many values inside of the VM machines array. Okay, so each object is going to get, this value, or get assigned these sets of values. Okay, so I just moved that down there because we're going to define a loop here, okay, and this loop is going to be for our ports. Is it ports? Yeah. Yeah, okay. So in order to do that, what we want to do is we want to access this value, okay? So we're going to use this value to define the machine we're using, because before we just had one machine, we could use config. Now what we're going to do is we're going to say our node array entry is what we're going to define our config as. So we're going to take our host name, which we define, and we're going to say node array entry, okay, and node. So we're defining this config, which is going to define variables for our VM machine, and specifically for this VM machine, okay, called node, which is the build prod, and we're going to alias it to what we had before, which was define host, okay. So with that defined, what we're going to do now is we're going to take our ports, because we want to define ports here, okay? But we also got to do something very important, in that we want these nodes, the values for these nodes, okay, to have a network interface, to have a host name, to have a network, to have a provider, and we want to customize our VM machine to have the memory we defined inside of our JSON file, okay, and we also want to have our config box defined as part of our node. So in order to do that, we're going to extend this block here, okay, the end of this block, and I'm going to extend that to the end right after our last value, and just type end. Okay. And as you can see, once I pretty print it, we're still in the same column. We have defined a new block, and with each iteration through the loop, okay, it's going to come inside of here. It's going to take its node name, and it's going to alias the node to define host. And we're going to now take this define host, because now it really matters. Before it didn't, okay? And I probably should have fixed it, but I let it go. So let's, and I'm glad I did, because it allows me to show you how we define each node explicitly. And because we're in an iteration loop, we want to assign each one of these config statements so that we are defining it for each individual host now. Now we're not just saying, hey, look, there's, we have one big file, and inside this file, it represents everything for one host. Now we're saying we have multiple hosts to deal with. So we're going to set it up so that each iteration incorporates all the steps we would have done for one machine, but we're going to do this now for all of the machines. And we're going to swap in the proper values that we need to do that with. Now, one of the things which we have set up is we set up a port array, okay? In that port array, which is right down here, it has a host, it has a guest, and ID. So what we want to do is, if we had 5 ports which we were opening for each VM machine, we want to iterate over each one of the 5 ports, just like we're doing with the VM machines by defining, build port and test prod, build prod and test prod. Okay, so to do that, we're also going to use an each statement, but first, what we're going to do is we're going to assign our ports. We're going to create a array called ports, which is going to hold one object at a time. Okay, the ports array, though, is going to actually hold all the entries inside of our port object. I hope that sounded right. In any case, let's do node array entry. Okay, and we're going to access ports. So now we want to use the same construct which we did before of ports, okay, dot each. I cannot type and talk at the same time, but I'm working on it. And we're going to alias that to port, okay. And I'm going to define the end right there, okay. And we'll go ahead and we'll give it a little cleanup there. Keeps it happy, keeps it easy to understand. So now we got a loop within a loop, okay? Remember, our first loop here, which is for each machine, and now we're doing a loop inside for each machine. We're doing a loop called ports to assign the value of each one of these ports to our command that opens the port, that opens the forwarded port. Okay, so I'm just going to come here and I'm going to say port, because we're accessing one port at a time, just like one machine at a time. So this is the first port for the machine build prod, okay? And we have, we're going to say ports, okay? And no, I don't think so. I'm going to say guest. And for a host, we're going to say guest. We're going to say port subhost. And I'm just going to take the ID away for right now. Okay, and because we really don't need it. But it's good to use a key sometimes to describe what that port is. And that was the point which I was trying to make, and I didn't, so don't worry about it. Okay, keeping it moving, we just defined a loop, and this one again says, you know, for each one of these ports, we're going to take the value of host and guest, okay, and assign that value to this network command that's going to forward the ports to it. Okay, so now let's do the same. Okay, in fact, I'm just going to copy these lines, okay, right here. Okay, copy. Okay, and we didn't have a share command before. So today we're going to create shared locations that we can connect to, like an NFS share. Okay, only I think this is going to be UMB. I'm almost positive. Okay, so inside of a node entry, we want shared. Okay, notice how I'm just, you know, I'm following the same convention which we had before. Okay, and we're going to have the each. So each one of these we want to iterate over. We want to call it the singular version of share. This command right here, VM network, no, we're not going to use VM network. What we're going to use is VM synced folder. Okay, so VM synced SYNCEDFOLDER. Okay, and this takes the share name, okay, that we're going to define. Okay, and let me see, what do we define that as? If we go up to share, okay, we want to define the host, in which is the directory on the machine that we're going to use, that we're going to share out, and we're going to define the mount point for that within the VM machine. Now, the dir share is relative to our current directory. I believe you can specify outside. I haven't really had a need to, because I tend to keep everything together. Okay, so we're going to change this to our share and host. And then we're going to change our, yeah, we can just do this. We can just say share. Okay. And we want to change this to type, and we want to call it VirtualBox. Okay, I probably should have defined a provision type for each one of these boxes, but since I only had VirtualBox, I figured that it wasn't worth my time. If you have multiple providers, for instance, if you have VirtualBox, if you have VMware, you might want to put that in. Later, we're probably going to update it and put that in, but for right now, I think we're fine. Okay, we're going to come down here because our loop is now done. We can go over each share and define each share, okay, for each of nodes. So if a particular node like build prod had 2 shares or 8 shares or 20 shares, that would be reflected here. And again, we want to define this is going to be node array entry. And this one, we want to use the node name. Okay. And for our private network, what we want to do is we want to take our IP value and we want to say that this is going to be node array with the value of IP. So it's fairly simple to do this swap. Okay. And we, again, node array. And what I'm defining now is the memory. Remember, we have a key inside of our JSON file called memory. And that is right here, right above our IP name. And for our host name, we want to, again, use our node array, and we want to use node. And for our box, we want to give it the node array and box. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up what we wanted to do in order to integrate JSON into our Vagrant file. Now, I probably misspelled a bunch of things. You know, we're just going to have to run validate on this, fix any errors, and then we're going to move ahead. Okay, and we'll begin by provisioning. But first, let's do a Vagrant validate. Did I save this? Yes, I did. Okay. I am famous for not saving things. And it's off and running in, oh, okay. I know what this is. This is the host path shared folder. Inside of here, we defined a folder called dir share. And Vagrant will make sure that that folder has to exist. So I'm just going to make a directory, make dir, and it has to be called dir shared. Yeah. It's an original name, trust me. Okay, and let's run validate again. Ooh, all right. Hey, I like that. Okay, so we have our Vagrant file that incorporates our JSON file into our Vagrant file. Okay, and this Vagrant file here defines for each one of our machines, it's going to define ports, it's going to define shares, it's going to find a host name, network, and it's going to modify the VM to include additional memory or the memory size that we specify in the node size and then the box. Okay, so the box is actually going to be CentOS. So let's see what we can do. Let's do a Vagrant status. Let's see how many it recognizes. Ooh, there we go. Okay, if you notice, I recognize the build prod and now the test prod. Okay, so why don't we stop right here? This is a good place to stop at. Okay, we can see that our machines are not created yet. So I'm going to stop right here. We covered a lot of ground, and this is getting a little bit long. We covered everything from actually defining our JSON file and getting it into our nodes array. Then we iterated through our nodes. So we went through loops. We created loops for our ports, for our shared, and we actually defined each one of the keys and assigned those keys to the value of each one of our Vagrant commands. Okay, So all of our Vagrant commands right now are getting our values from our JSON array. So let's stop right there. And in the next lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to start to work a little bit with them. You know, we'll run some Vagrant commands. We'll bring them up. We'll check it out, and we'll go from there. All right. So I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you very much for viewing my channel, Boston Devops Bill, and let's keep pounding keys. All right. Thanks.